initiated the Secured Embedded Architecture Laboratory with a focus on hardware security. He had worked as visiting scientist at NTU Singapore, visiting associate professor of NYU Shanghai, assistant professor at IIT Madras, and as visiting researcher at NYU Tandon School of Engineering, USA. He holds a PhD and MS and a BTech from IIT Kharagpur, India. His books include fault-tolerant architectures for cryptography and hardware security, cryptography and network security, hardware security design, threats and safeguards, and timing channels in cryptography. He has written more than 200 papers in peer-reviewed conferences and journals and collaborated with several Indian as well as foreign organizations. He has been in the program committee and editorial board of several top international conferences and journals. Devdeep is the recipient of the Swarna Jayanti DST Fellowship 2015-16, Data Security Council of India Award for Cyber Security Education, ASEM DEO Fellowship, INSA Young Scientist Award, INAE Young Engineer Award, IAS Young Associateship. He was awarded the Outstanding Young Faculty Fellowship from IIT Kharagpur and the Techno Inventor Best PhD Award from the Indian Semiconductor Association. He has recently incubated a startup on hardware security, ESP Private Limited at IIT Kharagpur, and is a senior member of IEEE and ACM. Now over to you, sir.
So thank you very much, and thank you all for this kind invitation. I would, without much ado, I would like to start with my presentation. So I hope that my my slides are visible and you are able to hear me properly.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now I would like to kind of like introduce you some of the things that we consider to be of importance in the context of hardware security. I know that this workshop is on like two topics. One is on cellular automata, and the other one is on secure hardware design. Interestingly, I had spent some of my years in like pursuing research in both of them. And today I will be more focusing on the hardware design part, or the security of hardware design part. And in a second part, I think, which is down this week, I will try to kind of talk about few of my like observations on usages of cellular automata in the context of designing secure systems. So to start with, my agenda for this talk will be, first of all, I will try to introduce you to the domain of hardware security. My group, I call this a SEAL, nothing to do with the US SEAL. It is, like it stands for Secured Embedded Architecture Laboratory at IIT Kharagpur. I will try to introduce you on the topic of Internet of Things, which is like a promising, like current day networks, and try to also introduce you on a topic which I worked quite extensively, which are called as side channel attacks, which are one of the very important concerns of hardware security designers. In particular, I will be talking about two attack vectors that threaten our crypto systems, which are called as power side channels as well as fault attacks. So fault tolerance is of great concern in the context of security. I will try to finally talk about lightweight authentication of devices. We know that there are like billions of devices apparently which are getting connected, and therefore security or authentication is of paramount importance. Many of these devices cannot support heavyweight cryptographic algorithms. So we are always in the pursuit of finding out new promising hardware primitives which will help us to like obtain lightweight authentication, so that the cost of the device doesn't increase manifold, but at the same time we are able to get the much needed security. So finally, I mean, like before I start, I generally try to kind of like talk about this example, which basically tries to highlight that there is a difference between theory and practice, and that is exactly where hardware security designers play a role. So this is an example of a very popular locking system which is there in our households and in other places. So you see that here, I mean, I have purposefully like obscured the name of the vendor, but you can see that it typically has a 6-bit pin digit which you are using. The idea is that the security designer thought that anybody who wants to intrude into this system needs to guess these 6 bits, and using that will be able to open this lock. However, the designer didn't envisage that the attacker can come up with a completely different way of attacking the system. For instance, in one of our lab, like one day, probably we didn't have much work, we thought of doing this. We tried to open the front part of this, the front panel of this locking system, and found out interestingly that there are 2 pins, which is one of them is the ground pin and the reset pin, which we found out from the catalog and other kind of like online available documentations. And we found that if you apparently connect these 2 pins, then the pins get zeroized, which means that after that anybody can enter like 6 zeros and open up the locker. So this is just very like taking with a pinch of salt, but what it tries to show that there is a huge gap between theory and practice. I mean, in theory there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And that essentially implies that it is very important when you are designing secure systems to analyze, design, code, but of course always test your systems. And sometimes the testing is not not emphasized, and that leads to insecure systems. However, testing, right, for secure systems is many-fold more complicated, because usually when we do testing, right, for software as well as for hardware, we know what are the golden requirements. However, for security, it is extremely difficult to model the adversary, because the adversary can like do anything which is strange. For example, in this case, we opened up the panel and tried something which was probably not anticipated by the designers. So that makes the like entire job very interesting. And I would like to kind of like highlight that if you think that secure systems can be solved or attained by cryptography, then there is a problem, because cryptography is a very good starting point to like achieve the objectives of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, as we see in any standard textbook in cryptology. But at the same time, right, it doesn't provide us with overall security, because cryptology is a very good starting point in spite of like several improvements that has happened in the world of cryptology. For example, we have now techniques of like doing what are called as post-quantum cryptography. We have the ability of like processing on encrypted data and so on. But still, right, it is not enough to provide us an end-to-end security. So we need more. And this essentially brings us to what we called as hardware security. So I will try to kind of give you some insights on why hardware, or why or how our hardware security is important. So the first thing that of course comes to mind is the speed. If you compare like the software speed versus hardware speed, for example, we know that in the internet, it's very important that we develop our web applications in which we are doing sensitive operations in this world when we are all struck off by this pandemic of COVID. We know that we are doing everything in an online manner. Even this workshop we are currently doing in an online manner. So while we may not think obvious, but all of us know that in whatever platforms we are kind of communicating, we are performing our operations, security and privacy are of paramount importance. Okay, so for particularly when we talk about things like e-commerce, net banking, and so on, we are knowingly or unknowingly using security. For example, we have got the secure socket layer, SSL, transport layer security, TLS. All of these, right, are open source implementations providing us access to cryptographic algorithms and operating thereon. However, they are time consuming in software, which means that many of the time, if you are doing your operations purely on software, depending on the applications, right, you may get a hit, and that hit may be good enough to knock out a particular technology. For example, you must have heard a few days before that when we were using this online platform called Zoom, there were security concerns which were raised, and which essentially has kind of ruled out Zoom being used for many of our government applications. While that may be dubious, but at the same time, it shows that security, right, is of paramount importance. So we need to accelerate cryptographic operations, and because of that, even CPU giants. And what I mean is that companies which have been developing processors or architectures have understood the importance of this, and have come up with specialized instructions which helps us to accelerate crypto. For example, right, we may be knowing that we have got an instruction which is called as AES-NI, which is a special instruction for performing the AES rounds. AES is standing for Advanced Encryption Standard, which is the worldwide standard for block ciphers. Likewise, there are special instructions in Intel ISA for performing carryless multiplication of, say, 264-bit operands, which are very important primitives in the context of performing crypto algorithms. So therefore, the advantages are, the obvious advantage, I would say, is in terms of, like getting hardware acceleration, which offers our speed, dedicated processing, and also, right, parallelism, because of the fact that you have hardware, you can essentially perform several things in parallel concurrently, and that gives you an enormous amount of improvement in terms of performance. However, another thing which is not often emphasized, and that is probably why, like where hardware security comes with a great promise, is that it can rule out many attacks which are possible on pure software. So in particular, right, okay, by the way, before I go into that, right, this is the example of the Intel AES-NI instruction, which is used for AES operations. So for some of you who are interested to look into the architecture, you can see that there is a paper which was published in VTS 2010, which gives an idea about how the architecture is being built and some of the internal descriptions. So this gives a very high throughput, as you can see, something like 53 Gbps of getting the AES encryption being done. So likewise, we also did some, experiments. Like there's an example of another promising crypto primitive, which are called as elliptic curve crypto, which is essentially I would say like the modern day de facto public key cipher operations, which essentially has slowly kind of, got kind of replaced RSA in the sense that this works with much shorter key sizes compared to RSA. While RSA is still, of course, important in terms of legacy, but elliptic curves comes with a lot of promise in terms of efficient public key computations. So typically, right, without going into the details of elliptic curve crypto, it typically takes two inputs. One of them is the base point, which is a point on the elliptic curve, and there is a scalar which is called as x, and it computes a scalar product which is called as x into p, which is nothing but adding the base point p x number of times. So this essentially is central to the computation of elliptic curve crypto, and therefore the overall performance of the elliptic curve crypto depends upon how fast you can do this computation or how fast you can perform your scalar product. So for some of you who are interested to get into or understand the like elliptic curves, here is a reference that you can see later on. But what I would like to rather emphasize is that so if you are doing like a standard elliptic curve implementation, maybe on like a processor, so here are some results. So you can see here that it talks about, this slide talks about a result which has been like the result of a prototype of an elliptic curve operation. So in particular, there are 10,000 scalar multiplications which have been performed on an Intel Core 2 Duo platform with reasonable specifications, and it takes you around 8 seconds to do this computation. However, if you take an Altera Cyclone 4 FPGA, which is essentially not very high cost FPGA, and you essentially kind of add it as a co-processor with your software stack, then you can do this entire operation in something like 4 seconds, which is almost like a double speed up. So that shows us, like the advantage of hardware. You can, like kind of, and in particular with the advent of FPGAs and, like low cost and easily programmable hardware, you can essentially add accelerators which can help you significantly to improve performance of your cryptographic operations. So therefore, right, the other point which I was trying to kind of emphasize is the aspect of security. And in this context, right, let us try to look at the classical architecture given or due to von Neumann, right, which is essentially very popular in most of our computing machines. Okay, and while I was making me the slide, right, I thought of like sort of appreciating this gentleman, right, I think, who also has got a profound influence in the other domain or other topic that we are also discussing in this workshop, which is cellular automata. So, however, what I would like to rather, like emphasize in this presentation is that he also came up, we know that he gave up this nice blueprint of computing systems, which is essentially a very basic model, but it's still kind of prevalent in most of our computing architecture. So we have got this typical, like fact that present day computing systems are still based on what we call as a stored program paradigm, which means that the programs like data are stored in the memory and they are getting executed one by one to perform our operations. So now where comes the security issue? Well, you can easily see that because of this fact, or because of this paradigm of computation, program and data are essentially are almost like similar. For instance, right, I mean, we know that in this particular mode of architectures, programs are nothing but sequence of instructions which are stored in the memory, and the CPU, which consists of various components like the arithmetic logic unit, the program counter, control unit, and so on. The programs are essentially executed just like your data is getting processed. So the consequence of this is, right, I mean, for example, if I tell you this funny looking number like 0x90abcd, right, I mean, the operating system or the software has got no way to understand that whether it's a code or whether it's a data, okay, because essentially it looks all the same. And that's the basic principle of this paradigm. Because of this, right, I mean, we know that and this essentially gives us enormous threats in terms of security, because you do not really know that whether you are essentially processing a data or whether you are executing a code which may be a malicious code, which can be a malware, which can be a Trojan, which can be a virus, which can be a ransomware. Okay. And because of, and the other point is, right, because of the shared memory, which is essentially a central part of the von Neumann architecture, there is also a bottleneck which we call as the memory wall. And in order to breach the memory wall, there are different processing maneuvers or features that have been incorporated in the computing systems, like the cache memory, the branch predictions, which have been developed. And this essentially, or these artifacts which have been developed, while it has helped us to achieve performance, it also has opened up Pandora's box for various kinds of attacks. For instance, I will try to go very quickly behind some of them. So this example shows us about a very classical attack which still now remains as one of the most prevalent forms of attacks on software systems, which are called as buffer overflows. So here is a very simple looking code which has been taken from this paper, Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit, written under the pseudonym of Aleph1. So you can see that if anybody, right, I mean, can observe this function, you will see that like here, it basically what it does is that it takes it's a simple C program, which basically does is that it takes or initializes the variable b to 0, and then it makes a function, say call function. It basically jumps into this routine and does some operations, and then again makes b equal to 1 and then prints b. So anybody, right, who is not really observing what this function is doing will probably anticipate that at this point b equal to 1 will get printed, because b equal to 1 is what has been assigned before at this point. However, this function just shows that it is a very cleverly written code. What it does is basically, as you know, that it kind of starts to manipulate the stack, and using that, it tries to kind of modify the return address to some other position which it basically would like to do. Okay, so in this case, if you're observing, right, what it does is it changes the return by some locations, right, and it basically tries to kind of manipulate the stack to perform this attack. Now, this return address maneuvering, right, can be easily understood or better understood if you look into the stack. So I will just try to give a very high level description of what this code does or what this function does. So you know that in the stack, right, you have got all these local variables which are getting stored. For example, you have got the local variables, you have got the return address, you have got the frame pointer, and so on. So what it does is that it basically measures where the return address is stored. In this case, it is like something like 12 plus 4 plus 4, which is 20 bytes. And therefore, right, it kind of accesses that by this line return equal to buff plus 5, which basically takes you the return to the position in the stack where the return address is stored. And then it modifies that value by doing this pointer dereferencing and incrementing it by some 7 odd values. Now this 7 is not like ad hoc, but it can be observed by the corresponding GDB dump of this code, and you see that what it tries to do is basically, the idea is that when this function was called, for example, here the function was called, and what the designer wanted is that when the function is done, it should return at this position and therefore do this b equal to 1. But what the attacker wanted was essentially to kind of skip this line And the way to do that is by changing the return address not to this location but to the subsequent like statement. And therefore, right, you need to skip one line, and how many and what is the corresponding value in the address. You can observe that in the GDB dump by seeing that each of them are some 7 odd values, and you can follow that at a later point when you have access to the slide. But if you believe me at this point, right, what it tries to do is that it basically tries to skip this red line, which is this assignment of like x equal to 1, and come to the next line. And therefore, right, since x equal to 1 is not being performed, or b equal to 1 is not being performed, what gets printed is the erroneous b equal to 0. So this is a very simple example to show you that one can modify the stack, and using that, right, can perform various kinds of attacks. You may wonder that, okay, I may have different kinds of protections like like stack guards and so on, but all of them have been shown, right, that yes, it can increase the defense, but it cannot completely remove the defense. So one of the strategies that you can probably adopt, and this one thing that we tried at some point, is to introduce something which is called as a hardware stack. So you have a hardware which basically performs or manages the stack, and also tries to compare it with your software stack. And whenever there is an anomaly that you observe, then you essentially throw an alarm to ensure that like these attacks are not taking place. Now these attacks are very very crafty. For example, in my simple benign code, I just try to kind of like change some assignments, but in a real life scenario, you can try to do something much more dangerous. For example, you can spawn a shell, you can trigger a virus or a malware, and therefore, right, it can lead to pretty serious consequences. And therefore, right, this is another place where hardware can be handy, because you can try to bring hardware assisted control flow so that the integrity of your flow or of your program is better managed. So the other point that I wanted to kind of quickly talk about is essentially the memory wall. So we know that we have the microprocessor with the cache memory, we have got the main memory, and here the cache memory essentially is used to bridge the memory wall. And the idea is that if there is a cache hit, then the access time is less, the power consumption is less. Whereas if there is a cache miss, then the access time and the power consumption are more. So that anybody who is able to monitor this can now do an attack. So here is a very famous attack that was published by Shamir and their group in Israel, where they say that, okay, so this you try to kind of take a unit where there is an AES algorithm which is executing, there is a crypto that is executing, and there is a spy which is co-resident on the same hardware, that is, it's processing on the same server. And this is not very sort of, I would say, strange, because nowadays we have got cloud computing systems and so on, where there are multiple processes which are co-residing and executing on the same hardware. So to begin with, right, so imagine that there is a spy which comes and accesses the microprocessor, and it fills up the cache with some arbitrary data, gives the handle to the AES, which makes an encryption calls, and there are several lookups it makes. So this is the footprint of the ciphering algorithm. And now again the spy comes back, and now if it tries to monitor the time that is required for its own access, and it finds out that some access will be more, whereas some access will be less, and that essentially means that the spy is able to understand and monitor the footprint of the AES cipher, and that can trivially leak the key. So these kinds of attacks are very powerful, and one of the reasons why they are essentially prevalent is because computing architecture has been designed with performance as a design or primary design criteria, and security being an afterthought essentially has opened up nice avenues for attacks. In particular, some of you who have been following the news probably have seen this news on Spectre and Meltdown, which kind of showed that even things like speculative executions, which are very common optimization techniques, out of order execution and so on, they have been one of the main reasons why security of our systems are abysmally poor. So to quote like Bruce Schneier, fixing them is not possible because it either requires a patch that results in a major performance hit, or is impossible and requires a re-architecture of our computing systems. It can basically take us 20 years back, because many of these things have been evolved over, say, the previous 20 years. And most importantly, right, this is probably one of the most important slides, I will say, security can be a game changer, okay? Because people do not understand the concerns of things until it hits the finance. So in particular, when Spectre and Meltdown were discovered, Intel stock, which was largely affected by these attacks, went down by like something like 5%, which shows that security can be a serious concern. I would say rather luckily, right, AMD was not affected by by the meltdown and Spectre attacks because of some design choices that they did, and therefore their stock essentially remained pretty well at that point. So this all shows. So this is a report from where I took this, and this shows that security is of importance, and this brings us to the requirement of what we call as hardware root of trust. So we all know that when we boot our systems, right, gradually the operating system comes into play, but we do not really know that whether our operating system can be trusted. And in order to do that, there is a concept what is called as the secure boot, which essentially starts from a small hardware device, which is called as the TPM, and it basically performs measurements which are getting appended into into what you execute. So therefore, you do not allow anything to execute, but you allow them to execute only if the corresponding measurement is belonging to some whitelisted value sets. Okay, so this brings us to this idea of what is called as the cryptographic hardware or TPMs, which provides us a small trusted base for performing various kinds of crypto algorithms on the hardware, like the RSA, hash functions like SHA, the random noise generators, and so on, which are extremely important and important to trigger even your software operations. However, although hardware was supposed to be be a nice panacea for several kinds of attacks, humans being humans, right, also found out very interesting attacks on the hardware. In particular, in 2010, there was a report from Black Hat conference which showed how to extract secret keys from TPMs by using attacks which are essentially based on probing and spying on the internal buses on some Infineon chips. In 2015, there was a report on a side channel attack, which is a differential power attack to extract secret keys from some TPM chips. So therefore, right, hardware attacks, while they are costly, but they are feasible. For instance, like there are side channel attacks which tries to monitor the analog signals like time, power, EM, and so on. There are fault attacks which basically tries to physically perturb the voltage lines, clock temperatures, and takes like X-rays, laser guns, and so on to create internal faults which can be exploited by adversaries. Likewise, you can also think of more complicated things like invasive attacks, which are based on, say, focused ionized beam, like machines or FIB machines, which can create test points and modify the chip structures from the rear side, which can open up your sophisticated internal lines with like mesh protections and sensors, and you can do actual probe-based attacks. So these instruments that you see are some of the snapshots of our laboratory infrastructure at IIT KGP, which we have built to perform these kind of experiments on hardware attacks. So therefore, right, there is a gap between theory and practice. Again, I come to that statement. So we have got limitations in standard cryptographic theory. So because of which even mathematically strong ciphers like AES and RSA can leak in the real world. So these sorts of leakages are called as side channels, through which a cryptographic module can leak information to its environment in an unintentional fashion. So again, to quote Bruce Schneier, if you think that our problem can be solved by cryptography, then there is a problem, because cryptography cannot solve us or provide us an end-to-end solution. So this brings us to the goals of hardware security. So while I would rather say, of course, we have got the goals of performance, while we have got the goals of security, like we want to kind of protect against side channel attacks, fault attacks, lightweight countermeasures. But the point is, right, we cannot completely eliminate the requirement of performance, speed, clock, frequency, latency, fast arithmetic, and so on. Okay, and at the same time cost, because we want to kind of reduce the amount of area requirement, the power consumption, the energy requirement, and that's why small and compact designs survive. And this is one of the particular places where I would say on the passing that things or cellular automata and cellular automata based constructions can still find importance. But what I would like to kind of also mention that while we are applying those kind of techniques, we also need to understand the security scenario, try to understand the attack scenarios, and only then our proposals, right, will be of consequence. So I will talk about some of these things in my second talk, but rather in today's talk, I would try to talk about some of the attack techniques. So quickly, this is our laboratory, which we call a Secured Embedded Architecture Lab, which tries to focus on attacks and countermeasures. These are some of the instruments and labs that we have on side channels, IoT security, CPS, and hardware forensics. There are several interesting projects that we are currently doing in our laboratory. For example, post-quantum security, of course, hardware security, CPS, Trojan detections, counterfeit detections, IoT security, and malwares and ransomware detection. So there are several side channel sources. In particular, we have been largely dealing with cryptographic algorithms. Threat models and security goals are also really important to properly define them. The protocols, the software, hardware, deployment and usage, and finally humans. And I generally try to kind of believe that it is impossible to design a totally secure systems with humans in it. So we will not even try that. So rather we will focus on the software and in particular hardware. And in today's talk, right, the remaining part that I have, I will be focusing on some of the hardware attacks which are possible, like side channels and behavior under faults, and also try to talk quickly about some of the authentication techniques. So this takes me to the next part of my talk, which is talking about the side channel methods. So we all know that IoTs are extremely, promising next generation networks, because it's estimated that by 20, I mean by now, right, I mean, or somewhere down the line, right, we will have billions of devices which are getting connected, and IoTs can revolutionize the quality of life. However, commercial IoT devices lack security measures, and it can have catastrophic consequence to mankind. So I will not really deliberate much on where the applications of IoT are, and we already know that. But rather, I will try to talk about this interesting presentation or work by an Israeli group which talks about an attack on IoT systems. So in this case, these are, as you can see in the diagram at the top, this is an office premise of an Israeli company. There are several companies over there, and they typically use, and nowadays we use in our offices these smart bulbs, which are used to kind of control the light and ambience depending upon our moods. So typically, like, these smart bulbs are IoT products where there is a feature of control and command, which means that if you are whitelisted, then you essentially can only control and command those bulbs. Of course, you do not want your neighbors to control and command your own bulbs, and that's why there is a requirement of authentication. So the authentication technique that is usually employed in such kind of systems are based upon computing what is called as a message authentication code, and that is also reliant on a very strong cryptographic algorithm which is called as AES. However, these attackers, what they found out is that they kind of inspected into this system one of these bulbs which were there in those premise, and found out that using the electromagnetic radiations, which are similar to the power traces that you acquired, they were able to recover the complete 128-bit secret key which are used in those bulbs while authentication. So what is the advantage of doing that? Once they did that, they could update the firmware in that device. And what they did is that when they updated the firmware, they ensured that there was that the proximity detector or the proximity detection step which were there in those systems were disabled. Which means now, I mean, initially, right, you were not allowed to control these bulbs beyond the distance. But after that, after the check was disabled, anybody from even a far distance can control and command those bulbs. And then they gave a nice demonstration of showing that once the bulb was installed in those systems, they showed that how they could fly a drone and show an SOS being displayed on those bulb systems to show that they are completely being possessed by the attackers. So there is a nice YouTube video of this also. So if you can just type IoT goes nuclear in YouTube, I'm sure that you will get that YouTube clip. So this again shows us that strong cryptographic algorithms are just the beginning. You can take a nice crypto, exchange inputs and outputs. So while mathematics guarantees you security till this point, simple observations of the power consumption can lead to the complete revelation of your secret key bits. So therefore, what are side channels? So side channels are covert channels which leak information which the designers of the crypto algorithms did not consider. It could be a simple if-else statement which is there in your program which can leak the secret information. So in order to do these experiments, here is a very close look at some of the setup that we have. In particular, say let's consider a power attack setup. So you can imagine that there is a crypto which is running on a crypto device, and that is what we usually call as the design and the test. And when your PC is sending inputs and receiving the cipher back, it is also observing the corresponding power trace or the EM trace by a probe. The probe essentially is amplified, and you get the corresponding what we call as a trace also along with your inputs and outputs of the cipher algorithm. So now you need to process that, and there are different ways. So here are some more things. So you need to process the power traces. So this is how a power trace of AES, for example, would look like, and you can virtually count the rounds in the AES, and you can see that in AES there are 10 rounds, and you can kind of count the number of rounds over here. So you can see here, if you zoom in down, then you will see that inside the AES operation, you can see that there are different types of like power consumption contours, which are because of the different operations with the AES performs. So this fact that the power consumption depends upon the various operations that are getting performed is what is called as simple power attacks. There is an even more powerful form of attack, which is called as a differential power attack, or DPA, where what is exploited is the fact that the power variation not only depends upon the operation, but it also depends upon the zeros or ones or the data underlying in your computation. So this was originally published by a famous paper in Crypto in 1999 by Paul Kocher and his team, which gave rise to a new field of research, and also a new company which was called as Cryptography Research, currently acquired by Rambus. So here are some quick snapshots on how DPA would work like. For example, this is the case of AES, which is the worldwide standard, and you can easily see that the 120-bit key that you have, which is like 16 bytes, can be recovered in a divide and conquer manner in a byte-by-byte fashion. So in this case, something like 15,000 encryptions can tell you that, okay, for one key byte, this is the corresponding key byte which stands out. So there is a statistical operation that is being done, and the statistics that is being computed shows some distinguishable spikes, which helps you to kind of distinguish the correct key from the wrong key. So this basically kind of trivially, sort of breaks your crypto system. And even if you are increasing the key length, right, you will not be able to defend against these attacks. So here is a very, again, simple, illustration of correlation power attack. And I will be very fast here to explain how it works. So in particular, right, what we do here is we take several plain text, maybe like D plain texts, and you feed it into your crypto system. And imagine that you can get it work for any cipher for that matter. So typically, right, any ciphering algorithm is made up of some some nibbles or some amount of bytes. For example, the AES, there are 16 bytes, which makes 16 into 8, which is 128 bits. So if I talk about AES 128 in particular, there is a 128-bit key, and I would try to recover the key in a byte-by-byte fashion. Okay, so which means I will recover the first byte, then I will recover the second byte, then I will recover the third byte, and so on. So that means, right, this is a divide and conquer attack, because you are recovering the key bytes in one-by-one fashion. Okay, and therefore the complexity of the overall key size is not really 2 to the power of 8 whole power of 16, but it is 16 multiplied by 2 to the power of 8, which is much smaller than 2 to the power of 128. Okay, and that means that you can do the attack in a very realistic manner. So what the attack does is basically, say, it tries to kind of find out, say, one key byte, and it starts to make all possible hypotheses of the key. We know that in 128, if you're targeting a byte, then there can be 256 hypotheses that you can make for that key byte, and that stands for these key hypotheses that you see in this slide. And then it starts to kind of input all the plain text or the cipher text. So you can do the attack either from the plain text or from the cipher text. So let us assume that you are doing the attack from the plain text side. So basically, take all the, say, number, say you are doing, say, 10,000 encryptions. You take all those 10,000 encryptions, and for each of them, you essentially process that with your corresponding key hypothesis. And then you come to somewhere intermediate and state. You basically kind of sort of based upon your key hypothesis, you try to make a guesstimate of your internal state. And once you have the internal state, then you apply something which is called as a powered model. So in VLSI technologies, we know that the most the most significant part of your power consumption is what is called as a dynamic power. And there are many models that have been developed to estimate your dynamic power consumption in a pretty accurate manner. And they're very simple. So it can be simple like Hamming weight or Hamming distance powered models, or maybe toggle count, and so on. So suppose you make a guess with Hamming weight powered model, and using that you come to something which is called as a hypothetical power. Now remember that you are also observing the real power, which is the actual power trace, and you try to develop some kind of correlation between the hypothetical power and the real power that you have captured. And if you find a strong correlation, and there are many ways in which you can make your correlation accurate, I'm not getting into all the details, but the top level idea is that if you are able to find out a good correlation, then you will probably bank upon your key hypothesis. You will probably say that, okay, probably my key hypothesis was good enough. So you will, depending upon the number of observations, you will initially kind of, like remove some keys, because some key hypothesis will give you a bad correlation, and therefore you can remove it from the set. And gradually, right, your potential number of key hypotheses will reduce slowly to eventually result you in the correct key byte. Okay, and therefore, since you have recovered the key byte independent of the other key bytes, you can do this process also for the other key bytes, and gradually you can recover the complete 128-bit key. So that is a broad, sort of way of working of these kind of attacks, which are called as CPA or correlation power attacks. Okay, so we have a tool where we kind of also try to kind of build, like using our incubation, which we called as ESP Anveshak or ESP Onveshak, through which like you can actually perform various kinds of sidechain attacks and fault attacks. This is a purely Python-based tool which can basically run on any platform. So the other important type of sidechain attack is what is called DFA or sidechain fault attacks, and I will also try to give a very quick description behind that, just to kind of emphasize that some of you who are interested in fault tolerance, I think fault tolerance for security can be a very exciting topic of research. So if, for instance, right, what you can try to see here is that on the left part of this slide, you will see that there is a fault-free ciphertext that has been obtained by encrypting a plain text. And on the right-hand side, when you are encrypting a plain text and you're getting the output, there has been some kind of fault induction that has been taken place. Okay, and the fault induction can be achieved by several ways. For example, you can, if you are dealing with hardware devices, you can play around with the clock line and suddenly inject a fast clock. You can inject a glitch in the voltage line. You can, if you are like paying something more, you can take an EM gun, you can shoot an EM pulse, or even if you are paying even more, then you can probably do something using a laser gun as well. So anyway, but there are many ways in which you can get a fault. Getting a fault is probably not so uncommon in real life because there are bugs all around our systems. So you get a fault-free, you get a faulty ciphertext, and you get a fault-free ciphertext, and then you feed it into some kind of analysis techniques, which will basically give you the secret key. So here is again a very top-level illustration of how a fault attack will work on an AES kind of system. So imagine that because of some random behavior, right, there is a random fault that gets created at the input of the 8th round of AES, and gradually that fault would spread throughout your algorithm. Okay, so here is like a quick, like how the fault will spread. Now, I'm not going into the details here, but you can observe that if you observe, for example, in this state matrix, if you're observing, say, like this state, you will see that there are internal bytes. Okay, but the internal bytes, right, are suddenly exhibiting some kind of relationships. For example, it is showing you that, say, this byte is like double this byte, or it is showing you that these two bytes are exactly the same. This byte is thrice this byte, and so on. So these relations are in the Galois field, and they are in GF to the power of 8, but nevertheless they are mathematical relations. So now, once you have those mathematical relations which have been triggered by the fault, the attacker can do something very interesting. The attacker can guess the key at this point, which is the last round key, and it can try to go back and see that whether these relations have been maintained. So what it can do, therefore, is it can come up with this bunch of equations which are dependent upon the inputs. I mean, it is dependent upon the secret key, and it also depends upon the correct ciphertext and also the faulty ciphertext. Okay, so therefore, if it knows the correct ciphertext and it knows the faulty ciphertext, it will try to make a guess on the key, and if the guess satisfies this relation, right, then it knows that his guess was probably correct. Else, it will try to again prune the wrong keys and remove them from your possible set. So this again gives you a divide and conquer strategy to gradually, like get the key and break your systems. Okay, so without going into details, I will just tell you that with one single fault, you can actually reduce the key size of AES to only 256 values. And this key conjuring process will take you something like 2 to the power of 30 trials, which you can easily run maybe in a simple computing system nowadays in something like 1 hour amount of time. Okay, so therefore this has got profound influence on several like real life applications. For example, in automotives, like we know that safety is a very important concern, and modern day computers are probably more of, I would say, computing systems than mechanical devices. There are several lines of programs which are probably much more than in many of our softwares. So reliability and safety is a major concern. For example, we have this ISO 26262 standard, which is a framework for the development of safe automotive electronic systems. And it provides us with several chips, which are called as ASIL chips, or Automotive Security Integrity Level Certified chips. And there are different levels from level A to level D. The idea being that if you are going to higher levels, then they are more secure against various kinds of reliability-based attacks. So in particular, we did an experiment on two such kind of chips. One of them was based on an ARM chip, and another one was based on a PowerPC. And we tried to kind of inject the fault in different ways. Like one of them was based on voltage glitches, and the other one was based on electromagnetic radiations. And then here is a quick, post-mortem of the results. So we tried two experiments. One of them was kind of trying to have some assemblies which will just do some additions and then compare that whether the addition is properly done. And in the second case, right, there was an authentication that has been done. So the idea is that if there is a correct key that has been entered, then you are allowed to get an access to a JTAG port, else you are denied to get access. So we tried various techniques, something like you can see here, like 7,20,000 attempts, where one of them was through the voltage glitch, the other one was using an EM gun. And we found out that in the first chip, there was 87% of time when they were not able to understand that there was an error, and it gave an erroneous output. But the system, because the system also has some kind of inherent fault tolerance, because it's an ASIL D certified chip, which is there in our automotive systems, but it is still not able to kind of understand that there is a fault injection which is going ahead. Likewise for ASIL D2 chip as well. So this tells us that safety and security are not the same. While you have got this ASIL D protection, which gives you guarantees against various kinds of random faults, but when you have an attacker in mind, right, since the attacker can purport the attack techniques and attack vectors, it can essentially reduce the key size very significantly, because a single glitch is more than effective to get your complete 120-bit secret key. So therefore, right, I mean, it tells us that that it is extremely important that we take care of such kind of attack vectors. So here is like a quick tour of a side channel infrastructure that we have in our laboratory, and I would just try to, I hope that you are able to hear the audio. Is the audio visible, by the way? Is the audio, can you hear the audio, by the way?
Yeah. Oh, audio is whatever.
So for some of you who are observing this, you can see that the value here is 0x15, but when the fault was induced, at that point it changes. So you see that it changes to 0x95. That is because of the EM fault that has been shown. And once the switch has been turned off, again it gets back to the original 0x15. So therefore the fault is intermittent and essentially can be utilized to recover the secret key. So I think I have another 10 more minutes or so in my presentation. So I will talk about the final part which I plan to talk here, which is on lightweight authentication of device, and try to kind of introduce a very promising hardware primitive, which are called as the physically unclonable functions, or PUFs. So the idea, as we have already understood, that security and privacy is of paramount importance to IoT devices. We talked about this Philips lighting systems and so on. So here is a very simple experiment that one can try using these home automation systems. Apparently, what we found out is that they have authentication systems where they generate random numbers, and then they communicate with those random numbers on the clear. So if you have got eavesdropping tools like Wireshark, then you can see those random numbers, and using that you can masquerade. So one of the things that probably like many of these systems do not have an end-to-end security is because crypto is often costly. So with this pursuit, we try to look into I would say like low cost, less costly tools, and we also try to venture into a project along with several companies. One of them being Wipro. We try to develop like an IoT solution which is based on less resource components. So one of them is that brought us to this exciting primitive which are called as physically unclonable functions, or PUFs. So I will try to give a very high level description of what PUFs mean. So a PUF means it's kind of a fingerprint of the device. So likewise, it doesn't kind of really implement any mathematical function. But the idea is that if you have got a PUF device and if you give an input to it, it gives you a response which is kind of tied down to the device. So it means if I take two PUFs which has got the same circuit implemented on them, and if I apply the same challenge to both of them, their responses are statistically independent. That means the response knowledge of one of the device does not give me any information about the response from the other device. So the reason why these PUFs work is because of the complex and the variable nature of the underlying physical materials, and it also depends upon the underlying, like the various kinds of parametric variations which are there in many of our present-day CMOS technologies. So here is a quick overview or quick description about how, say, you take a ring oscillator, which is a very common circuit, and it has been implemented on different FPGA devices. You can see that the oscillating frequency, right, essentially varies. And there are like two types of variations. One is inter-device variation, and the other one is the intra-device variation also. So both of them are utilized to develop these circuits, which are called as PUFs, which tries to give you something which are called as fingerprints of the device. So once you have this low-cost fingerprint of the device, you would try to also, apply them in your your security protocols. And the overall objective is to, reduce the cost, raise the security, because there are no real cryptographic keys that are being stored, but rather the entire device itself starts to operate as a cryptographic solution. Okay. And there are different metrics which are important for PUFs. Uniqueness, which tells us that every PUF's response is kind of unique to that device. It also has to be reliable, which means that across temperature, time, and so on, it needs to provide you a consistent output. But then when you are applying the PUFs for authentication, this is how you probably in a classical manner do. So imagine that there is an IoT device which has got a PUF, and there is a verification unit, which is basically one, and then the device wants to authenticate to that service. So therefore, what this service does is basically it has got the challenge response for that device. So it knows that with what challenge, what response it should give. Remember that a PUF is unclonable, so it cannot have another copy of the PUF typically. So what it does, it sends a challenge, it gets a response, and then it matches across its response. So the idea is that once you have used this, right, you cannot reuse it anymore. So you have to remove it, because the attacker also has seen this challenge response pair, and therefore you are not able to kind of reuse it again. So this is a very sort of, I would say, like primitive way of authenticating, but there are many limitations here. For example, the bare CRPs are used, and the adversary, if it is able to collect the CRPs, can also imitate as the legal client. So this motivated us to come up with a solution, which I'll just give again a very high level description, which has got two phases. So the idea of our proposal was to kind of complement this with a public key algorithm, so that the CRPs are not really being stored in the verification unit, but also what you can do is you essentially can store something on the cloud, and the cloud, right, being public, anybody can access it. So the security, right, doesn't rely on that. So the top level idea here is that there is an enrollment phase in which you device which has got the puff, and then once a puff, you basically there's a security credential generator, which basically you can think of as a service provider. So it basically gives the challenge, it gets the corresponding response, and then it augments it into some kind of tuple by applying cryptographic hash functions, and then that tuple is stored into the cloud. So now in the real verification phase, when the verifier wants to kind of communicate, it fetches that information from the cloud and then uses it to generate a challenge, gives it to the node, the node responds, and then there is a cryptographic operation that is getting performed, and if that matches, then there is a corresponding the service is allowed. That means the node is allowed to enter the system, and the verifier also kind of is able to kind of authenticate itself to the device. So there is a mutual authentication that takes place. So more descriptions of this can be found out in our IEEE TDSC paper. If some of you are interested, please have a look at it. So here is a corresponding implementation of this, also along with the video surveillance camera. Many of the video surveillance cameras that are installed around us do not have really speaking authentication, and therefore one can inject stale videos to that and do something which are called as the meet in the middle attacks. But we believe that using the ideas of puffs, we can prevent against such kind of attacks. So again, here is a quick video of the idea, which was published in the conference called WWW in 2020. Okay, so I hope that this works. So this basically shows us that using a PUF, how you can prevent a meet in the middle attack on wireless protocol, which is called as WPA2. So the idea there was that I mean the supplicant, which is essentially in this case the main server, is not able to do this attack. The fake access point is detected simply because it cannot respond with the correct PUF because it doesn't have that legitimate PUF response along with it. So this essentially there are many sort of things that we are trying to work on this. For instance, one of the things that we like, as you can understand, in the previous case we were talking about a PUF where the PUF essentially, since it is unclonable, so you need to have some kind of mechanism of storing the challenge response or the legal challenge responses in the verified end, which essentially can limit certain applications. So one of the things that we are trying to work on is whether there can be twin hardware devices so that two devices can cooperate with each other and try to kind of work together. So for example, here is and there are different ways of looking at things. For example, just on the passing on a lighter note, since you are you know that there is this famous botanical garden in Shibpur, Howrah, where you can see that there is an example of this tree where every leaf is kind of unique. So that is the basic concept of PUF. However, if you can see this, like that was also thought about for snowflakes. That means all snowflakes are kind of alike. However, there was a report which shows that there are something which are called as identical twins in snowflakes. So this kind of motivates us to see that whether even that is possible in hardware circuits. And I will not go into details here, but try to say that we are trying to build on a similar kind of things which we call as physically related functions. That means there are two devices which provides us with related responses for certain inputs, and we are trying to see that whether we can use authentication protocols using such kind of systems which we can apply for ad hoc networks. So this is a joint work that we are doing with DRDO, and it's on the progress. So quickly before I stop, there are many future directions on hardware security. One of the most promising things that I believe that is important, in particular in the context of India, because India is one of the second largest telecommunication markets. However, although we have got like several applications like mobile banking and so on, but still, right, we do procure a lot of things from the foreign fabrication units, and secure systems cannot be built without hardware security modules. So although we have got huge success in terms of our software exports, but we also have got a lot of hardware imports, and this kind of motivates us to see that whether we can have intrusive methods and non-intrusive methods to sanitize the hardware designs that we buy. So in particular, one of the things that we are trying to work on is develop good optical techniques. As you can see here, there's a small chip, even lesser than the coin, as you can see. And on the right-hand side, you can see an image that we have found out using the new FIB camera that we have right now in our laboratory. So you can even see the antenna that is inside this chip at such a high resolution of something like 10 nanometers. You can observe that. So we are trying to see that you can apply interesting techniques using machine learning and so on, which will help us to diagnose such kind of interesting structures inside the hardware circuits. So basically to understand whether your hardware is trustworthy. The other thing that we are also trying to be very much interested in is to see that whether you can have hardware support for what is called as fully homomorphic encryption. To answer this question, can we design and implement leakage resilient, concretely efficient, quantum resistant FHE schemes? So the idea is that we know that several data, critical data is being stored in the cloud, and you would typically like to keep them encrypted. But if you encrypt and keep it right, then you cannot process on them, you cannot perform analytics on them. So this brings us to this idea of what are called as fully homomorphic encryptions, which is a holy grail in computing, which allows us to do arbitrary computations. But at the same time, at the present day, they are pretty inefficient, and their hardware can play a very significant role in accelerating many of these operations. So to conclude, what I have just now mentioned is that the hardware security in IoT or connected systems are extremely important in our modern society. And there are various kinds of surfaces, like on one hand, you have got the things. On the other hand, you have got privacy and clouds. We strive to develop novel techniques and solutions for side channel security, design new hardware primitives for end-to-end IoT security. Finally, right, the solutions that we do, right, are very are important, because at the end of the day, right, we have to keep in mind that if you really want secure systems, then you cannot leave any link weak, because the link that you keep weak essentially will be exploited by the adversary. So there are several. Before I stop, also you can. This is a quick mention on the MOOC course on hardware security that I have right now. It's there on NPTEL, but I'm not running it on MOOC. But if you're interested, you can go through all the lecture materials related to this. So finally, thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I would be very happy to address.
Thank you, sir, for your interesting talk. Is there any question?
Well, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So in the beginning, you were talking about stored program architecture, and then you pointed out some major limitation, so that
Yeah.
data and program they are stored, and the threats due to that one. So are you, it's a different kind of question, not maybe exactly related to this talk. So the question is, are you thinking of some kind of architecture apart from this stored program architecture, where data and data and program, they will not reside side by side?
Yeah,
And
so that's a very I would say like an important question. Exactly, yeah. I mean, we are not only us actually. There are many other schools also which are thinking in that direction. So, for example, of course, like we have got the hardware architecture, right, which is like one solution to achieve that, where you do not, where you have that separated out. But there are also, people who are building on or trying to build, like new generations of architecture, or come up, because frankly speaking, when like von Neumann's architecture was proposed, right, security was not a concern, right? So
yeah,
that was not essentially a component of or objective of the design. So yeah, and particularly nowadays, since RISC-V has come into play, right, and I was reading one article also from Hennessy and Patterson, right, which is kind of proposes us and encourages us to look into the open source hardware architectural tools to exploit and explore, like new generations of architectures which are more robust and more security, even from the design perception.
okay, thank you.
Any other question?
Yeah, one thing I would like to mention is like in hardware security, right? I mean, it is very difficult and also very I would say interesting, because it brings together several skill sets under the same umbrella actually, and that makes it very exciting. For example, recent like few days before, we were able to do an attack which we called as a RASL actually. So this attack was an attack on OpenSSL. That means essentially it's a cryptographic library which we published in the journal or conference called CHESS, which is going to appear this year around September in 2021, but is also on the web right now. So the basic idea of that stemmed from a very simple hardware stack which is there in our computing systems, which is called as a return address stack. So the return address stack is basically a small hardware stack that we have to ensure that the branch predictions are like better when we are jumping back from some function calls. But that also helped us to kind of craft an interesting attack, which eventually, right, and there are many layers on the attack. There was one layer where we had to hack the scheduler which is there in our computing systems, and then you have to kind of complement it with a lattice-based mathematics to eventually get the OpenSSL signing signature. I mean the signing key. So I mean, what is interesting is that when we are working in hardware security, right, we can bring forth like our insights from different backgrounds and can come up with interesting attacks as well as interesting defenses.
Sir, that hardware stack program is written in C, the interface for that hardware stack.
You mean to say like like just now what I mentioned correspond? You're talking about that?
Yes, sir. The how can one interface and address that hardware stack? Because software stack we can address by written some code, writing some code there. But how
Okay,
and how
so
can we
you know, you do not deal directly with the hardware actually, but you try to use some kind of side channel. So just to give you an example, so you know, like this hardware stack that I was mentioning, suppose imagine that you know, like the idea is that you, whenever there is a return address, that gets kind of posted or pushed into the stack, okay, and the idea is that you try to push that into the stack, okay. But then the moment that data goes into the stack, and after that when you are making a function call, if that data is available in the stack, then your time, right, of getting that function call done is very small. But if the data is not available in the stack, that is, it has been removed from the stack, then your time is much more. So in all these attacks, right, largely you try to measure the timing side channel, but the timing side channel or the timing variations, there is an influence of the hardware on that. So you measure the timing, so you are basically doing still, you know, like doing your attack at the software layer, but you are exploiting a reason which is very deep down inside your hardware. Okay.
okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your talk and for joining us.
Thank you.
We are ending this session and we will meet at 2:30 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.